Hello, today I am joined by consultant podiatric surgeon Trevor Prior. Trevor, how are you doing?
Good, thanks. And you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. And your name's come up a few times with some of my recent people that I've done these with, and just with I've started hanging out a lot more with podiatrists over the last probably 6 to 12 months. And your name definitely gets mentioned a lot by the likes of Nick Knight, Zoe Wilson, Sean Savage, Emily
Okay.
Ball, Tony Gavin, all these people.
The check's in the post.
I didn't say it was good, but
Okay.
no, it's all
In which
very
case,
good.
it must be infamy because if it wasn't good and you're asking me on.
Yeah, no, I think it's really an interesting area. So historically, I'm sports science background, but I'd worked a lot with mainly physios. But then in the last, let's say that last year or so, we've been doing a lot more in podiatry. Um, and I'd come across your name from your work at QMUL, and so I'm really intrigued as to sort of how you got to where you are and how it all links in now. So like what made you get into the world of podiatry?
There's kind of two answers. There's a true answer and there's an easy answer. The easy answer were my mum and dad were both chiropodists back in the day. But a true answer is I wanted to do a maths degree, but you have to do two maths A levels. My school wouldn't let me do two maths A levels. So I was doing maths, physics, and chemistry. I was doing really well at maths, but not very good at physics and chemistry. End of my first year, sixth, initially I thought I'd be an electronic engineer because it sounded pretty cool. And at the end of my first year, sixth, I realised I wasn't going to get the grades. And my dad said, "What are you going to do?" I went, "Don't really know." He said, "What about chiropody?" I went, "No, leave it out. Why do I want to do that?" He said, "Well, it's not been so bad for me and your mum. We've been fairly good about it." And we were having a beer, so I thought I'd humour him. Go on and tell me a bit more. Actually sounded quite interesting. So then he said, "Well, do you want me to get you an interview?" So I said, "Well, I've got nothing to lose going for an interview." And a little bit of nepotism. They knew everybody. I got offered an unconditional, which in their eyes was meant I would work as hard as possible to get the best possible grades. Whereas me, I don't have to do anything. I'm in, so I got the worst possible grades you could get. I tell some of my patients that I got an E and two O's at A level, and they go, "What?" And so off I went to college, and actually found it was pretty interesting. Although, I mean, I qualified in 1983, so it was almost a different profession back then. Biomechanics, yeah, our biomechanics training then was pronation is a triplanar motion. See you later. That literally was the extent of it. But there was so many facets to it. And I was really lucky that my first job was in Tower Hamlets with some, I think there were six of us and three or four became podiatric surgeons. So that gives you an idea in such a small group of people my boss at the time was in charge of Tower Hamlets, but also City and Hackney. And if you look through City and Hackney back in those days, it was almost a who's who of became people in the podiatry profession. So I always tell the story that if you work with all those people, then you've got to be a bit daft if you don't learn something. So that's how it all started, really. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Like you talk about that environment where you're all working together and everyone's gone on to do things. What is that? What's the driver for that happening? Is it coincidence? Is it just the environment? Is it you all push each other on, or what do you think it is?
I think it was a mixture. I mean, I think the guy Don Beaton, bless his soul, was our boss, and in fact, he was in charge of three districts. Can you imagine that these days? And he wasn't particularly good at the job himself, so he was a manager. But he did have a bit of a vision, and he sort of because they were involved a bit in the teaching at the colleges, and they just seemed to attract people. And when you get a few people in, and you've got something that's a little bit different, and back in those days, people from outside of London wanted to come to London to work, and it was a lot more affordable, and it just almost sort of becomes self-fulfilling. And then if you just happen to, I mean, I think there must have been a bit of luck in it that there were so many people that really had something about them, but also all got on. So we'd have combined meetings and stuff like that. But stuff like, well, what we're doing this time? Okay, well, we're going to go down Vicky Park and play rounders. And by the way, give us a tenner each, and Jill and I will go off and buy a load of spirits and get big distilled water containers and make cocktails, and you just go and help yourself. We do stuff like that. And so we just had this group of people that just had such a good fun, but at the same time, and I mean, Tower Hamlets back then, when I first started working, the pathology that we saw, I mean, it was still a rundown area. The Isle of Dogs had nothing built on it. It was still like a wreck. We see people that had survived the war and just learned so much. It was just like almost within a year, it was like, wow, have I really learned that much?
Yeah. Yeah, and so in terms of you saying it's a completely different profession, like what were the main things that you were dealing with at that point?
Well, I think when I qualified, the mainstay of work really was routine care, right? So routine chiropody stuff. Obviously, ulceration and infection. Again, even then, the involvement we had was different, but no one was particularly interested in dealing with feet at that time. I mean, if you we'll talk about podiatric surgery at some point, but even orthopedics at that point, if there was a foot problem, it was stuck on the end of a list for the registrars to practice on. Literally, it was like that. But the pathology was unbelievable. Although orthotics was always quite a big bit when I was at college. We were taught even how to adapt shoes, do balloon patches and stuff. So orthotics was kind of around, but not in the way we necessarily think about it. Well, I was going to think, I did loads of home visits, believe it or not. I did all the home visits in Tower Hamlets for 2 years on a push bike initially. Imagine going around the Isle of Dogs on a push bike when no one wanted to go down there. And I always remember going to see this patient in an old people's home, and they were on bed and they had all these kind of ulcers and stuff with swollen legs. And I wasn't a doctor, but I said, well, you shouldn't have swollen legs if they're on a bed. I mean, they got a problem with their heart, and this patient had heart failure with swollen legs and ulcers, and they kind of it resulted in them getting admitted into hospital. I mean, it was literally like that, and then it was sort of, so that was, I qualified in 83, and that was round about the time that biomechanics was moving over here from the States. And there's a guy called Ray Anthony who was really the guy that really pushed it in this country. And he ran a couple of courses, and the two or three people I worked with at the time was Nat Paddy who I still work with, Caroline Robbins, who's now in the States, and Diane Nicol. And I think Caroline went on how to make an orthotics course, and I went on the advanced biomechanics course, and we just started doing it. And Don, being the visionary he was, bought us a treadmill. And we had no cameras because you didn't have video analysis really back then, and we watched people running like this, and we on our routine patients, we'd sort of stick a bit of felt on that was a bit more biomechanical, and they'd either come back next time and say that's fantastic, or they'd come back and go, oh, you think, they walk back in and say, I think I'm wearing that, take it off. So we kind of learned a bit like that, and it just sort of pushed on from there. And so we were lucky that we were able to learn some new skills and employ them straight away. There wasn't some of the barriers that perhaps there might be now.
And how interactive was it with the other departments of physio and within that? So what was the overlap in there?
Yeah, actually, I think again we were pretty lucky. I mean, the Barts had one of the the London had one of the first sports medicine clinic. And I remember there was a physio by the name of Val Nettlingham, and I did some work. She was with Essex Ladies, and so I used to go down to Essex Ladies with her and just not paid, just to learn some stuff. And I don't know if there's a sports med doctor called Ian Beasley, and Bezo was a GP in Newham, but he did the sports clinic at the London. And so we started doing his orthotics, and this one day I get a call, and this guy says, "Oh, you don't know me. I'm a sports doc up at the London. We've got a patient that's running. I think he might need orthotics. Can you see him?" I went, yeah, fine. So we had a quick chat. He goes, "Oh, I'm the medical officer at Leighton Orient." He said, "We could do with a podiatrist down there. Would you be interested?" I went, "Yeah, all right then." And it said, okay, put me in contact with a physio. And so I started doing some work at the Orient. But so Bezo was somebody that had a little bit of vision. So we worked closely with the medics in the hospital. They were good, the physio department. I mean, the relationships were different, right? They were the formation. But again, the you don't quite know whether it's rose tinted glasses or not. Just everything was a little bit easier back then. Some of the barriers to working, which I understand why there's got to be these frameworks and stuff, but the frameworks were much looser. If you wanted to do something, as long as you got your job done, you could do it.
Yeah. Well, then what do you think about the change in things? I know you said that you can understand why it's happened, but is that advancing things?
Well, I think if you look at where all the professions have gone from a knowledge and treatment perspective, as you progress, then you have to have more of a tighter framework. And also because, you know, people may want to look at different techniques, you have to have some kind of criteria where you can't just go and practice and do anything. So you have to do it. The problem with it is as an organization becomes bigger, then you can't necessarily always rely on 100% integrity, and therefore you put more things in place to monitor stuff. So your paperwork becomes more. Um, and in some ways that's good. In other ways, it's just that, look, I've left my NHS post, and it was the natural time to go. But I'd sort of got to the point where I was just a bit fed up of all of the paperwork and the machinations. And I was fine because I'd been I moved across to Hackney in '89 and stayed there until I retired from the NHS a couple of years ago. So I was there a good 30 years, and I knew most of the people. So you kind of, as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of the decisions gets made in a conversation in the corridor rather than rather than a formal meeting. But I'd kind of had enough of that side of it. But if you're starting in the NHS now, that's what you know. So that becomes your baseline, right? But I'm not for any moment suggesting that there shouldn't be any kind of framework there. In fact, if you look at incidents and Datex reports, I always used to encourage my team, if you think there's anything you've done, do a Datex because you've got a pathway. So it's not that you don't do that. It's just sort of it just seemed so much easier back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah, less paperwork, probably less going on as well in your life, even emails, all these sort of things. There's a lot
Oh,
more to
mate,
consider.
I remember when my office when I qualified, there were no mobile phones, right? There were no computers. All right. I remember the day my office in the NHS got internet access, right? And when I first set up a video gate system in the early 90s in a private clinic. Well, so Don, who was the guy that was the manager, actually happened to be the chiropodist for West Ham. But because he wasn't very good, if they had any problems, they used to send him in for us to see. So when he was going to retire, because I was working at Orient, he said, "Oh, do you want to do West Ham?" And he passed West Ham over to me. So I started doing a clinic with the West Ham physio at the time, John Green, in his clinic, and I set up a video analysis system, and it had 4 security cameras with a quad splitter that went into a VCR that did freeze frame, so you could do freeze frame, and it cost £5,000, and that was in like 1993, 94. You can do that on your iPhone now.
So yeah, what is your view on that? Again, I suppose it goes back to what we were saying before about the way things move and change, because it's obviously amazing technology, what you can do with things. But like, what's your view on the role of tech? And I suppose, yeah, 2 questions. So for one, on well-being of practitioners and people in general, and then also on that the advancement of the profession.
Well, the first thing I should say is I'm a definite technophile. I love tech, right? So, I've got in our clinic now, we will routinely be using in-shoe pressure analysis and 3D gait analysis to evaluate our patients. And so I think, and look, we've started using AI to do our notes. So we record the conversations and it does everything. So I think tech has a massive amount to offer. And, if I look at how things have changed. West Ham gave me one of those brick phones that Del Boy had, but how much things have changed in the last 30 years. God knows what they're going to be like in the next 30 years. So I think one of the dangers with tech is sometimes you've got to be open-minded enough to be realistic about the results it gives you. So if we take gait analysis, for instance, if I look at pressure analysis or 3D, it's given me a lot of objective data, but still a degree of our interpretation is subjective. And it's very easy to try and get it to say what you want it to say. And the one thing I've learned from a gait perspective is actually, if you really look into it, it often tells you what you don't expect to see. So people go, oh, that's rubbish, right? Because it's not what they expect to see. Actually, what you say is, well, why does it say that? Let me learn from that. You know, without a shadow of a doubt, my ability to assess people is far better having been able to question myself because the objective data hasn't told me what I expect to see. So I think that's brilliant. I mean, the problem from a well-being, I think we can offer our patients more. It's not always definitive, and patients don't always want to hear what you have to say. And you know, when I talk to people about orthotics, for instance, I could sell anybody an orthotic, but I don't sell loads, and we use a percentage on patients because in a whole chunk of people, I'm not convinced it's going to do the job, or if it does do the job, it might cause another problem. You know, and there's all the issues that go with it. And sometimes it's harder not to give, even when we do the foot surgery, sometimes it's harder not to operate on someone and say, yeah, come on, we'll do the op. You know, and you kind of, you have your knowledge base, but you develop that kind of sense as you get more experience. And I'm just not sure this is going to work for you.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's an interesting perspective on the tech side because I think we that's our bread and butter on the tech side is that say we were working with EMG at one point and
Yeah.
it's like, well, is that muscle's firing? Is that good or bad? There's no good or bad on it really. It's like you need to break it down and understand it a little bit more. So, but we also do get asked a lot, right? Well, what's the protocol? What's the thing for this? What do we do for this thing? Whereas, as we know, everyone is different. And even within elite sport, there can be major differences between positions or athletes, even. So, what's your view on having protocols, like suggested treatment methodologies or assessment things for anyone?
The problem with a protocol is that almost by definition, you have to follow it. Right. So it's a semantic, a guideline is perhaps a better term, but what if you go through the process, the first thing, obviously, clearly you need to have a diagnosis, right? So, you can't manage anything without a diagnosis, but what the responsible practitioner knows is, okay. So, well, let me give you an example. So we did a study at QM, it was multi-center, multinational, looking at plantar heel pain. And what that study did was it took all of the papers that have been published on plantar heel pain. It was something like 15 or 16,000. It set the criteria so it's for interventions. It set the criteria for what was an acceptable standard of paper, so high quality. So I think we got down to about 55 papers, and did a meta-analysis of that. What it also did was to say, because if you say there's no evidence for this, that doesn't mean that particular intervention can't work. It just means that nobody's demonstrated that it could work, but you have to be cognizant of that. What it then did was expert reasoning. So interviewing experts who are either researching or published in the area around the world to get their views, as well as asking patients their experience. So you get this kind of big picture, which ends up with a best practice guide that says, well, from an evidence base, these are the reasonable things, evidence-based and best practice guide, reasoning. These are the reasonable things to do. So that you get X, Y, and Z. And what was quite relieving for me was that most of the things there were what I was doing anyway. But when someone says to me, well, what about, I know someone asked me the other day, acupuncture for their heel pain. I said, well, there's no good scientific evidence to support it, but by the same token, it's unlikely to do any harm. It wouldn't be something I routinely refer someone for, but if you're happy to try it. The problem comes and I'm not picking on acupuncture, that was just an example. The problem comes that if somebody's offering a treatment that has no evidence base for it, and either it's being provided on the NHS, which we can't really afford to do, or the person's having to pay a lot of money to do it, right? That's where the issue comes, right? It's like, if there's no evidence, so let's say we take treatment X and it works on 10 people, right? Then we can't say, well, the evidence base is pretty weak. We can't justify, the insurance companies wouldn't cover it. The NHS wouldn't provide it. You don't give a monkeys if you're the 1 in 10, right? It worked for me. And you go, well, it worked for me. So they put online, it worked for me. Oh, it must work for me. It's a bit about saying to people and educating patients, so like, you can try that, but so I think having a guideline is around understanding where there's evidence. So there's evidence for this, and then understanding where there are acceptable good practices, right, that maybe push the boundaries a bit. But when you're pushing the boundaries a bit, you tell your patient that's what you're doing, so they know.
Yeah. And do you think that that's what do you see from the clinical population that are offering, whether it's a new technology, new treatment, whatever it may be? Do you see that are they adopting that I suppose just trying these new things, or do you feel like they're more waiting to have enough evidence to do it? It's a big question, but like what do you see?
Well, I think if you look at elite sport, they'll always push the boundaries of what can be achieved, because one they're under a pressure to try and get as quick a result as possible. Two, the individuals want to be playing as much as possible, and three, and a lot of them, there's enough cash to be able to do it. I mean, back in the day, I did some work with Chelsea and went into the change room. They had a hyperbaric oxygen chamber in the changing room, right? A single one and I'm talking now, 20 odd years ago, right? So that was pretty way up there. And I think, but what you'll find is the good thing now is that in most of the good level sports, elite sports, they've got people that are properly qualified in sports medicine doing it, not just somebody who's just doing a little bit of part time. So what they'll be able to do is say, okay, right, well, this may be pushing the boundaries a bit, and our evidence base maybe not as strong as we want, but this is not going to do you any harm, right? And it's got the potential to help you. So, whereas if I'm treating Joe Bloggs, who's playing the money themselves, so I get someone in, they've got to self-pay to have a PRP injection, and it's going to cost them £1,200, and saying, do you think I should have it? I said, well, you might be better spending your money on something else to start with, because it's still a bit speculative. It's getting that bad. I had a patient recently with some fat pad changes underneath her heel, and we've really struggled to help her. And I was very reluctant for her to have a steroid because it could cause fat pad atrophy. I mean, a long discussion. In the end, she ended up having some PRP, but because the PRP may help her, but it's very unlikely to make her worse off, right? So it's very much around making the patient understand and making sure you've covered the bases. So I don't mean to just talk about heel pain, but someone comes into me and says, I had this heel pain. So I'll spend quite a bit of time finding out what they've actually done and in what order have they done it. Have they done it all together? And actually, well, I'm doing all of this, but it's still painful. But, I take the kids to school by foot and collect them. I walk the dog 3 times a day, and I've got to do all the stuff at home, right? Well, with the best will in the world, your foot's not going to get better, is it? Because we treat a foot or a knee or whatever, there's someone on the end of it, and more often than not, their expectations are unrealistic. I saw someone yesterday, and her heel pain is 60% better, right? After, I don't know, 6 weeks. And I have to tell you, for me, and she had this for 18 months or something. And for me, that's a really good progress after 6 weeks. But she's frustrated because she can't get back on the treadmill, stuff like that. I said, well, feet take time. You're 60% better. And we've got other things to do. You have to hang on in there. But they don't know. They want to get off and get running again and wonder why it gets worse. You must see it where people go what I call subclinical. So you examine them, they've got a problem, they're complaining of their pain. You get them on a management plan and they go, oh, it's feeling great. But if you examine them, they still hurt, right? They stop doing everything. They go back to activity. They go, oh, it's just come back. And I go, no. It never went. It just went subclinical, right? You have to chase it out. Especially with something like plantar heel pain.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. It's good to see you're obviously really passionate still about like understanding and the different things that are coming through. And like, I'm just interested, like, for when you were starting out, like, what were your aspirations? So where did you think you were going to be? What did you think you were going to be doing at this point of your career?
I had none, Zero, zilch. Bearing in mind, I got into college just because that was the easy route. And I actually failed one of my first year exams and they gave me a recommended pass. And I thought, oh, so in my second year, I started going out with the girl that was in my year. She worked, so I worked. And by the third year, I was fed up with being a student. I needed some beer vouchers, so I worked hard to get out. And then it was just a bit of case, I was doing a bit of this. I was actually working on Fleet Street on the papers as well. So I had a mate of mine, his uncle had a business where they get all the first editions of papers and take them to all the other papers. So I was doing that 7 nights a week. I was working, I was doing 3 nights overtime, doing the home visits on the push bike, and just sort of, I just had a kind of, I developed a lust for knowledge by then. So it was a thirst and it was just absorbing stuff. And I did a teacher qualification. The first year I qualified, then they had a postgraduate degree for podiatry. So I enrolled on that and it sort of happened. And my daughter asked me the question and said, how did your career develop? Because if you'd said to me at 18, right, here's what you're going to be doing when you're 40, 50, 60, I got no chance. Forget that. And I said to it, yeah, all I said was, yeah, all right then. So every time someone asked me to do something, I went, yeah, all right then. So the Bezo, what about doing the podiatry for Orin? Yeah, all right then. And then the physio said, will you come and work in my sports injury clinic? Oh, yeah, all right then. So I'm working in sports injuries clinic. Now all of a sudden I'm an expert on sports injuries. So the college that I'd started teaching in, because I said, yeah, all right then, said, will you do all our sports medicine lectures? I thought, I better learn these properly. And so I got every paper I could find on every condition from the waist down and learnt them. And now I was a sports injuries expert.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because I remember chatting. So I've done one of these with Ian. I love Ian. Ian's just such a great, humble person. That's, he's obviously done some really interesting things, but he was quite, I think he did other things before he got into medicine. And I think he said that really helped him just with,
Yeah,
he wasn't this super driven person, really. It was like, right, well, he ended up doing what he's done and got into it, but he's also got quite a laid back attitude to it.
very. He's chill. I think he was a postman, right? Listen, Bees and I became really good friends because of Orient, and we just had so much fun down there. It was just really, really good fun. And he worked in this sports injuries clinic, so we actually we did a proper MDT. I mean, the physio at the time, Bill Songless, was a kind of old FA physio, but Bill surrounded himself with people that were qualified and stuff like that. But his clinic was all open plan and we'd have our own patients, but Bees would go, Chev, come and have a look at this. I go, Bees, come and have a look at that. And it was a proper MDT, and we had such good fun. And then, over the years, we worked in a football club together and different clinics and stuff like that. And he's been at QMUL as well. And I always go, Bees, how long are you going to be here for? Because someone rings him up and says, oh, can you come work for us? I think he might just be getting to a point where he isn't, but it totally chill, right? And it's been a pleasure working for him over the years. And he's helped a lot of people. He's got a lot of respect.
Yeah, absolutely. That definitely has. And like, do you think that from that fun side, like whether it's in sport, like sport's a completely different beast again to like we had Gary Lewin on and those Arsenal days and all of that side of it. And a sport is so different now. The fun doesn't seem to be quite as prevalent. But like, what's your view on that? Do enough people have fun when they're working in general or in life in general?
It's difficult to know. I think is a little bit down to your personality. The more experienced you are, the better the knowledge you have, the easier it is to have fun. But also, if you move up the rankings, it's up to you, isn't it? You can influence how much fun people have, right? So when you first start in a job, when you first start out and you feel a bit nervous, you don't have the experience, you don't have necessarily all the knowledge base, and you can't really influence. You're told what to do. It's a lot harder to have fun, isn't it? If you work in a professional sports club and the teams fly. Look, when I worked at West Ham, if they won a game, we'd have very little to do after a game, right? And everyone would be cheerful. If they got mullered, then we'd be really busy in the treatment room, and everybody was a little bit like this. I think there's a time to be professional and serious. There's a time to be a little bit more light-hearted, and you like to think that you work with, if you can build a working relationship with the people you work with, that you know when to do that. and you can still enjoy yourself. I mean, I think when you have a really long clinic day and it's patient after patient, and some, the ones I call the shoulder saggers, like you see the name on the list and you go, oh no, that's going to be hard work, and you got 4 on the trot. It's not going to be such a fun afternoon. But by the same token, a different patient comes in and you start talking about something completely different, and you learn something and you just get a real rapport with them, and that's fun. Or you get something that's really interesting in, and or someone's really grateful. I think it's a pretty soul destroying job if you can't find some fun somewhere in it. And I mean, you joking. I got asked to go and see a player at a football club between Christmas and I'm a Chelsea supporter, and the doc said to me, he said, "Where would you rather be between here?" I said, "Chelsea," and he looked at me and went, "I'm not supposed to say that," but so it's having a rapport with people, knowing the right time to do it. I think you have to have fun when you do it, otherwise there's no point.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's definitely is important. But like you say, doing it at the right times as well. So, and then in terms of, you mentioned that QMUL, and I see a lot of the things that we were supporting that with an event. I think it was last week or the week before on things. There seems to be a really nice setup of things. Like Chris Myers, I know, gets involved in some of the teaching down there as well. Like how did that setup come about, and how did you get involved?
Oh, well, for starters, I mean, it's one of the oldest sports courses in the world, if not and it's been going for years, well before I got involved. John King was really the forefather of it, who unfortunately passed away recently. Nat Padilla and Dylan Morrissey have been involved right from the get-go. And almost a who's who of sports medicine have been through there in terms of docs and a lot of the physios and stuff. And so I look, I'd worked in Tower Hamlets for 6 years. I went to Hackney. It wasn't a million miles away. Dylan and I had worked together years ago, and it's all a small world. You get to know people, the likes of Dave Perry, all of that crew. So I knew quite a few of those anyway, and they wanted to look to how to involve podiatry in the course. And Dylan had said to me, "Do you know anyone that would be interested in doing the job?" And I said, "Well, what's it involved?" And he told me. I thought, "Oh, that sounds quite interesting, actually." They said, "Oh, are you interested?" I said, "Well, I might be," and we had some discussions and stuff. So I joined with Nat to then set up podiatric sports medicine, a PG cert in podiatric sports medicine, which was the first ones dedicated for it. So now we're able to put something under a formal educational umbrella, but also make it very clinically relevant, so that you go in and learn the evidence base, learn some research techniques, but by the same token, come out the other side with some real change. We wanted to change people's practice. So, Simon Lack, who leads on it now, it's physio, I'm sure they do a sport. There's a sports injuries assessment, an advanced sports injury assessment. So that really delves into history taking, examination, and literally, well, the pods don't do shoulders, but they do lower back and all lower limb. We did the podiatry stuff where they would do suturing, blood taking. We take them into the cadaver lab to do guided injections, and we did some biomechanics specific stuff. So these guys would come out and say, "Right, now off you go," and that's morphed into the masters in podiatric sports medicine. And so we got more and more people coming through. So that Ian Griffiths is now part of the team, so he's added a lot to the team, and it's a really, really great team, actually. And I said to someone the other week, combining the clinicians with the academics works really well. And everybody just gets on and has this supports one another and stuff like that. And so it's kind of that. I don't do that job for the money. I do that job because I enjoy it. I enjoy the people, and also it keeps you kind of at the edge of evidence base and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, it has got that reputation as being it is a great setup, and you see a lot of the different activities. We were down there at one of the events and had that caught up with Dylan just on some of the things. So yeah, it looks a really good setup, and loads of people speak highly of it. And in terms of your own private practice, then, so how did that get set up, and how do you find running a business?
Yeah, right then. I'd started lecturing at my old college, and I decided that we needed to do reports on biomechanics. So I sent this report out, and I don't know if you ever remember a clinic called Biomel, and it was run by two physios, and they were a little bit visionary in their day in the sense that they geared it a lot around rehab. So they would use Cybex, isokinetics to assess the patients and then rehab them, and it was a who's who of of sports people, royalty, all kinds of stuff. And they got a hold of this report and said, "Oh, we'd be really interested in you coming down and doing some work." So I started doing some work with them, and that again was educational. I learned a lot, and it was a fascinating time. And then I just started to do a bit of private work. And then someone said to me, "Would you like to come and rent a room from us in the city?" So I said, "Yeah, right then." And then that person had loads of contacts, and it started to get busier. And back then we didn't have social media, but I'd started because I was doing the sports medicine and the bio. People were inviting me to lecture, and then I started doing the podiatric surgery around about 1990, and then for about 6 years I went to the US once a year to go to different surgery service, see what they were doing. But Ray Anthony, who'd introduced the biomechanics, had told me about this podiatrist in America that was using some pressure analysis to design orthotics. I'm thinking, wow, that sounds pretty cool. So I contacted this guy called Howard Dannenberg, who's very well known in our profession, and said, "Oh, any chance I could come out and see what you're doing?" He said, "Sure." So I did a week of surgery, and I went up to just north of Boston to see him, and we hit it off really well. And he had this insole pressure system where you can look at, so you put it inside the shoe and you can see how the foot loads. And he would then design an orthotic, retest it, change the orthotic till he got it right, and then demonstrate where he got. I'm like, wow, that's got to be the way forward. So I got back and I got a different system called PDAR, which is by Novell, and started using that in clinic. And that's probably mid 90s. So that sort of then started to get a bit busier. Then I got contacted by an Australian podiatrist, said, "You got any work?" And I said, "Well, come in, let's see what we can do." And he sort of pushed me to do a bit more video analysis, and we pushed the PDAR and kind of went from there. And it just sort of built. And am I a businessman? Not really. I mean, I've learned how to do business, but it's interesting when you work as a podiatric surgeon. In order to operate, you have to be in the right facilities, and that usually means being in a private hospital. There are some clinics, but and they if you've got your own practice, so you've got your own building, you've got your own practice, you can approach a business in a slightly different way than if you're picking up your bag and you're going to different hospitals, right? It's a slightly different approach, and it's a real fine balance of getting the business model right versus you're treating people, right? And that's where it's always been a challenge for us with the gait analysis, because we use quite advanced kit, and in order to make it viable to do it, you have to charge a decent rate for it, but it can't be astronomical. So it's balancing all up, and then you need the right admin support, and that's all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I couldn't say I'm a businessman, but I've learned to run a business, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think that's probably what the vast majority is. I can certainly empathize with that way. You don't get any training, you just do it and you kind of learn, you make loads of mistakes and you try and make it work. And that, in terms of that charging piece for it, that's one of the things which is always, I'm always really interested because I visit clinics all day, every day. And there does seem to be that sort of decision in the head of we shouldn't be charging. We don't want to make money from this, but then how do you advance? How do you train? How do you recruit? How do you do all of those things? How do you balance that dilemma?
Uh, well, you know what? When I started and I was doing private work, so people say, "Oh, we reckon you should charge this." It becomes a little bit different in order to be able to for people to be able to claim their surgery and stuff back off the insurance. Then you have to have a certain level. So we have consultant recognition, and they have fees that they agree to pay. It's a little bit different now in the sense that they say we'll only pay you this. So you sort of develop a fee structure, and then you do have to, no, it's not acceptable for anybody to not have a pay rise, right? Although I didn't get one for about 10 years in the NHS, but so you periodically put them up so that the fee structures just kind of evolve really. And I don't have too much of a problem. I kind of always thought to myself, sometimes I go, look, just don't worry. I come in, I'll see you for nothing. I was going to think the day that I can't do that is probably the day that, and I can't afford to do it on every patient, but, the fee structure is sort of being gauged a little bit by being involved with insurance companies, which changes things a little. But I think looking at a lot of colleagues who are in private practice who aren't perhaps consultants, they've got a much better idea now about what they should be charging. And why are we any different to solicitors, lawyers, whatever? We're not, right? They have a structured rate of pay, and there's no reason why. It's just because you can get healthcare free at the point of charge in the NHS that people feel, you shouldn't be doing it. When you train to be a lawyer, you don't feel that you're going to be going out helping people for nothing. There's going to be a fee structure, but we could go into the NHS, which means we are ostensibly seeing people for nothing. That's the difference.
Yeah, that's a good comparison, really, because it's like it's a professional services, and yet the charges, solicitors, accountants, some of their fees are, they're very high, and it's accepted. So I think a lot of it is just, it becomes ingrained in society that that's what it's charged and that's what it is. Whereas I'm a believer but I think it is changing, and it needs to change to allow people to actually grow and develop the private healthcare market.
The real secret is to have a great secretary. So you don't talk finance with your patients, the secretary does. Someone asked me how much an operation costs. I go, I've got no idea. I've got no idea. Ask my secretary, she'll tell you.
Yeah, that is a good way. Yeah, keep it in that capacity. And then so you're doing so many different things, lecturing, your business, you involved in a running shoe, that side of things. How did that happen with the shoes?
It started with way back in the day in the early 90s when the facility orthotics first came out. Through my contacts, I got asked to lecture for them, and so I started doing some lecturing for them, and then they decided they wanted to do what they called a think tank. So they got people from different countries, and part of that was to design an orthotic. So I designed the facility Prior, which was supposed to be for football boots and low profile stuff. And then they started doing footwear as well. So the Vionic shoes come with orthoses already in it. And so I do some testing for them. And we did a bit of work with ASICS way back in the day. And then I got contacted by a lad, Greg Lever, who was a performance sportswear student at Loughborough and wanted to do a project on making a football boot. And we ended up, cut long story short, making a bespoke football boot where the stud plate was the orthotic and building around it. And it kind of, we asked if you're a businessman. Well, we kept 100% of a business that made nothing. But no one's made the boot since, and we still almost gone there. So that gave me a real experience, and we used selective laser sintering, which was a precursor and probably better than 3D printing, and that was back in 2002. So following on from that, then did a little bit work with Nike, some testing with them, and then a good friend and colleague of mine, who's an Australian podiatrist, Simon Bartold, who back in the day helped ASICS design produce the Kayano, the 21, whatever they were, the GT 2000 range now. He was now working with Salomon, and he asked me if I'd like to be involved in that think tank, and Nick Knight was part of that, and you might know Andy Franklin Miller, and so we did some stuff with them. And then a couple of years ago he called me and said, look, I'm involved with a different company now, are you interested? I said, well, what do I have to do? And he said, you have to come to New York and lecture for 15 minutes. I went, yeah, right then. So off we went, and so got to know a bit about the technology. And then the inventor, who's a physicist by background, said, look, I'm looking for a distributor in the UK. Do you know anyone? So I asked around, and didn't get any particular interest. And Simon said, look, I'm going to do it in Australia, and I'm going to try and do quite a bit through medical. And I thought, well, you know what, let me look at this technology. And there definitely is a different technology, right? And it's based on physics. And I'm like, wow, okay, Scott, what about that then? Thinking, well, it's easy enough to set up another business, isn't it? While you're working, while you're doing an ultrasound PG cert. And we spent the last year, although we've been selling some, every time we do a gait, we try and test a pair of the orthotics. So we do the 3D and the pressure analysis to really get an idea about what they're doing and how they influence function. And I think it's genuinely exciting. because it's using the principles of the forces that we generate when we walk and run, which are predefined. You can't do anything about them. They're there. But how can a shoe actually interact and offset some of those forces? What are the different points you can do it? And a lot of what we've done in the past has probably been a little bit misfounded. And I think we're only just beginning to kind of scratch the surface. But I wear orthotics. Well, actually, when I wear those shoes, I don't have to. It does it for me. Literally. I said to him, explain to me how a flat shoe can control pronation. And he said, it's straightforward. He said, when your foot hits the ground, so if you imagine, the analogy I give people is you're in your car and you've got to brake over 100 yards or 50 yards. Over 50 yards, you have to slam the brakes on harder, right? Well, at impact, our muscles are effectively our brakes. They're controlling motion. So the closer you are to the ground and the harder the ground is, right, the more you have to slam the brakes on. So the only way a shoe can help you is to be thicker, right? So it increases the braking distance, right? So you can make that a softer material, right? So that slows down movement and it will slow down pronation. But if that material stays the same density all the way through the shoe, as you go into propulsion, you carry on pronating. So you lose frontal control. And the propulsive force is far greater than the impact force. So actually, the material at the front of the shoe needs to be firmer, because if it's firmer, it stops it collapsing and you get frontal plane control. And we see that with the in-shoe pressure analysis. We see it slow down that movement, right, on a fairly consistent basis. And the only reason it doesn't is if the driving force from up here is so great, there's only so much a shoe can do. You don't get as big an effect. And so it wouldn't be unusual to sometimes see it working really well on one side and not so well on the other side. But better than if it's the same density all the way through, the shoes just collapse. Right? Yeah. It's fascinating. It's fascinating.
No, it's really interesting. So, and how is it being received? Like, how are they going? Like, how are you selling them?
Well, interestingly, the running shoe market's a really hard market to get into, right? Because there's, I think Nike spent something like 4 billion or 4.5 billion on advertising a couple of years ago. So it's a hard market to get into. And the reality is, with the running shoe stores, do they need another pair of shoes? Well, probably not. But that's, people have got to kind of start to get their head around the technology and why you might need the shoe. So, we talked about those forces, but if you and I run, we're different sizes, we generate different forces, right? So having the same shoe doesn't make sense. So each of the models of the shoe have different densities. So now we literally have a calculator where you put your height, sex, weight, and if you're a runner, speed, cadence in, and it says, well, this is the best model for you based on the forces. Well, that's quite a hard concept for shops to get their head around. Okay. And therefore, what I wanted to do really first and foremost was to understand the product, which is what I've done a large. We are looking at through medical in the first instance, and then probably online. We're sponsoring a guy called Adrian Hopkinson, who is doing the Land's End to John O'Groats. And he's doing something like 60 to 70 miles a day. Right. And I've got to know him for a different thing. He said, well, would you interested in sponsoring me in the shoes? And I went, yeah. He goes, oh, wow, these are comfortable. Right. So he's over the moon. And so we're sponsoring him. So it's a bit about trying to sort of, you've got to re-educate the model of what you're trying to achieve with the shoe and why you're trying to achieve it. So I'm not in a huge rush to become Nike. I think what we want to do is to get the principles out there. We're probably where we wanted to be at this stage. It was really kind of January that we started to start the promo. We went to the National Running Show to get some feedback there, and we have done a couple of podiatry conferences. We're sponsoring Adrian, so it's building from there. But it's really exciting, actually.
Yeah, no, it's just really interesting to do that. And with all these things that you're doing, then, like, how do you switch off? Like, how do you get balance in your life?
Not very well at the moment. I think well, we were talking before. Up until June, there's a bit too much going on. I mean, my hobby is golf. And I try and play golf most weeks. I do like to do a little bit of workout and gym stuff, but chill at weekend. Probably, if I was really honest, I'm working a bit too more than I want to at the moment. But that's when you get these different opportunities come up, you look and say, do I want to do it? Is it exciting? I mean, the last year, relearning about the physics of running and looking at it a different way, I could sit in front of my computer and just do that. That's just like fun, right? And just looking at, some of the gait stuff. And that to me is like reading a book or watching a film or whatever, because I just enjoy that. That's not hard work. Doing the accounts is a bit more boring and, I don't know about you, but my biggest bugbear in life is checking patient letters. I hate doing that. It's just like the AI reduces loads of it because it gets most of it right, but it's just, so the things that you like and things you don't. And but these opportunities come along and they're sometimes once in a lifetime. And I kind of thought with the shoe, if I don't do that, I'll always regret it. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. I don't see it. The only reason I think it will fail is just if we do it the wrong way. So I need better life balance, 100%. But part of what I'm doing now is building towards getting that better life balance.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, so what would your advice be to people either starting out in the industry or already established people?
Established is probably no, okay. So if you're starting out, just say yeah, all right then. Right, be prepared to give anything a go. Always listen to people, and it's never ceased to amaze me how someone I met or attended a lecture 20 years ago, 20 years later says, by the way, I remember you. We've got this has come up now. We'd love to do a bit of work with you. I think if you're established, it's much harder once you're established. So you kind of have to take stock of where you're at, what you want to do. Some people will say, look, I've got a very comfortable income. I enjoy it when I go to work 9 till 5. When I come out, I want to do X, Y, and Z. And they're very happy with that. Well, why change it? Okay. If you're going, well, I'm a little bit frustrated with my career, or where can it go? So, the thing to do is to identify the things that you enjoy, or maybe the things you're not so good at, because there'll be the things you don't enjoy. So you make yourself better at the things, or look at where the profession's going. So, for me back in the day, it was definitely going down a podiatric surgery route. So there was no way I was not going to do it. I would say now for loads of pods and physios, it's ultrasound, MSK ultrasound. That's the direction it's going. The musculoskeletal stethoscope with injection therapy. It's going to open up masses of opportunity for the professions. Or look at your gait stuff and say, what can I get out of there? It's not necessarily about having the cheapest gate system or the easiest gate system. It's something that's going to challenge you. So, because it makes you look at your patients in a way you don't really understand. So you have to understand it. And only by doing that can then people develop the research questions to go away and try and find it. So at QM, I work with the guy that runs the lab there, Stuart Miller, who's a extremely smart guy. And we've got some great research projects going at the moment looking at 3D, and we've actually got a prospective running study going on where we recruit the students and hope to go on year after year and get big data. So some of the stuff, it goes, right, come on, what are you thinking? How do we turn that into, we've got to analyze that a bit more. We got one of their PhD students is looking at machine learning and how we can use that for gait analysis and stuff. So all of that, the kind of clinical work can feed into that and then feedback and redirect what we do with the clinical work.
Yeah, no, yes, it is. It's fascinating seeing the tech out there. Like we're doing, you mentioned the ultrasound, and we're supplying so many people. Like Zoe's going to be doing some teaching, Nick's
Yeah.
doing work around the strength and conditioning piece of like objective testing, force plates, and so on. And there's a lot more kit that's accessible, affordable, and also in demand from clients now. It feels like the clients they want more because they're paying for it privately and not as NHS centric. So where do you see it going? And also to add into that, like where podiatry fits, because as I was saying at the start, we work with physios, sports therapists, sports rehabbers, SEMs, podiatrists now, osteos. There's a whole range of professions, and
Yeah. Well, it all overlaps a bit now, doesn't it? I think the thing about the foot, it's the only part of the human body that's unique to the human, which is why we can walk upright and no one else can, right? It's a complex structure that takes a lot of understanding. I have only really managed the foot for 40 years. I still don't know everything about it. Okay, I I think from a podiatry perspective is to own the finer detail of the foot, really understand the anatomy, try and understand the function because it's so varied, and then having that appreciation how the rest of the body affects it, but how the foot affects the rest of the body, is then saying, okay, well, if I work with a physio who's really good at doing rehab, there's no reason why a pod can't do rehab, but if someone's doing it all the time, right, and they're the cutting edge of that, and okay, what's the you talk about force plates, right? They give a certain amount of information. So what's the right time to do a force plate type analysis? So what kit do we need to be able to advise X, Y, and Z, and who are the right people to be involved in that process? And you're always going to get in every profession people that sort of, you have physios that have a particular interest in the foot. You have podiatrists that have an interest in rehab, right? Chiros will have that, osteopaths, their own stuff. So you've got your core profession, and you can have people that sort of sit on the periphery doing different things. But the more they can talk together, right, and bring the ideas together, right, the more likely it is that we'll be able to improve our patient care. Do they all have to work with one another? If someone's seen an osteo has a really good understanding of the foot and they do loads of rehab, they're probably going to be fine too. I think the challenge comes when we are managing a patient that we can't get better, that's not responding. Why aren't they? Who do we call in to give an opinion on? And that's where the MDT comes in so importantly, right? And I don't think there are enough MDT setups probably in the private sector, certainly for a lot of clinicians, right? I'm not saying they don't exist, but they often get driven by a consultant push within a big private clinic or hospital, right? And even then, sometimes it's just, but I want to be part of the MDT. Well, what that really means is, well, we can all see these patients and they don't really talk. You want people that are talking together, that can see the patients together, that knock their heads together and say, right, what do we think? Where else can we refer? And sometimes you just come up and say, well, we're not sure what we can do, and maybe we can't help you. Hopefully that's not too often, but yeah. So I look, it's exciting for people. Like I said, in another 30 years time, goodness knows what will be available. I think we'll be using IMUs a lot more. That's probably the way forward once the processing becomes that's one of the joys with the Run 3D. Normally when you do a kinematic analysis, it takes you hours to process the data. With the Run 3D, you press a button and 90 seconds later you've got the report. With IMUs and EMGs and stuff, getting the data out is the difficult bit. Once that can be automated so you get proper reports, right, then that allows you to do more. EMG data is interesting, isn't it, right? Because it depends on where you stick the electrode as to how many muscle groups you recruit. And
it's a real grey area on it, and but even from a scientific standpoint, research perspective, there's so many variables still that you can do, and there's been some quite interesting technology that's coming out now that's trying to make it more streamlined. Because I think a lot of the stuff we were working with Narax on for a few years, and brilliant stuff, but for one, it was 100 grand for the full kit. And then also there's so much, you need to be a biomechanist who is specializing in this all the time to work on it. So it's like, how do you create something that can be used in clinical practice? That's really what I'm keen to do. Is to how do we do it? And I think even like you mentioned an interesting point earlier on about choosing the right tech, where there is stuff that's, whether it's shockwave, ultrasound, force plates, there's different levels of whether you want a 3D force plate, a not, a 2D one, and everyone, including, companies, are telling you our machine's the best. How do you what's your advice for clinicians to when they're looking at tech? I can imagine it's very overwhelming, that it's like, well, for one, is this right for me? Do we need it? How do we afford it? And then which one do we pick?
Oh, well, that's a great question, isn't it? Wow, where did you start there? I mean, there's got to be you have to have an understanding of what you're looking at. So, I will never believe what a rep tells me straight off. Right. I said, well, tell me what the technology is. Right. Where is your evidence base for it? Now let me go off and look at what the literature says about it. Let me ask some people in different fields about the pros and cons. How easy is it for me to get the information out, and where's my interpretation with it? Which is, that's just on its own. I remember being asked for one of the companies to look at an insole system that was, that in theory could tell you what orthotics you, and it was using an inertial sensor. And it was saying, well, we can measure the pronation. I said, well, how do you do that then? Because it's just flat, right? And it's sitting in the shoe, so it's actually measuring the angle of the shoe, not the angle of the foot, because we know that the foot's going to do something different in there. And they go, well, actually, what we've done is we've done some algorithms. Okay, so it doesn't really do what you're saying it's doing, right? And you've embedded it in an insole that's a centimeter thick. So they've got a centimetre heel lift inside the shoe. And we often give people heel lifts to change their function. So how are we looking at that? And it's trying to understand what the technology is doing, how it's doing it. And I don't think that's very easy for a lot of people to do. I think the biggest thing I would say is you don't, it's easy to pick up on a gimmick, right? It's easy to say, right, oh yeah, that's going to make the practice look good, right? Whether they understand it or not. And I have a little bit of a problem with that, right? I think if you look at a bit of tech and you say, okay, I know how to do some interpretation with this now. How much is it going to cost me? How easy is it going to be to do it? And how am I going to integrate that into my current practice? If you could do that well and accept that you may have limitations for the information that you can get out of it when you start using it, but you will develop those, then it's then about being honest with the patient. So not claiming to the patient that you could. I was years ago, when I was at West Ham, one of the companies came with a pressure plate, ran one of the players over it and said that they could predict why they were getting a hamstring injury from the pressure analysis. I'm like, tell me how you do that then, right? Because you can't. Because, for instance, what you can see on a pressure analysis might be an early heel lift, right? So you can see that they've got an early heel lift, but you don't know why. That could be because they've got a short leg, fixed knee flexion, ankle block, calf inflexibility, 4 or 5 different things. You can see the consequence, but you don't know why. You've still got to examine that patient. So, like, what you can claim out of what you get from a bit of kit is really important.
Yeah, I do find it interesting when companies do claim that stuff because you just straight away, it's like, you don't think these people, as in you, are told this stuff, our machine's going to do this, it can do that. It's like, it can be helpful, but it's a medium, it's a support to whatever else you're doing on that, whatever it may be. It's like, I do find it interesting when people do make such bold claims and with such conviction, and I think that is a problem in the industry.
Mm. Well, I would say I'll go back to what I said before. When we do our gait stuff, it's a subjective interpretation of objective data. Right now, we might have, so if we do a 3D gait and someone's got high vertical excursion or an excessive step length, there's clearly some evidence in the literature that if you have those, it can predispose to X, Y, and Z. So we can say, look, these are contributing factors. So one of the things we might want to do is shorten your step length or do X or do Y. Right? When I'm going through the gait stuff with people, I say, you have to remember, I'm not going to be able to explain every finding that we get here. We're looking for trends. We're looking for this. And my interpretation of that has evolved over a 10 or 12 year period with the 3D because it's a steep learning curve. And particularly with something like that, it's a research tool. So people are looking at one very specific question as opposed to we're assessing Joe Bloggs 3, 4, 5 times a week and looking at lots of different stuff. And then we're running them in 2 different shoes and sticking some orthotics in and seeing what differences it makes, and it doesn't tell you what you expect to see. So you got to go, okay, how can I interpret that that's going to be a benefit to the patient, right? Okay, but it's a reasonable interpretation. And there'll be some things I can't can't explain, and I'll go away and I'll think about them and I'll look, and then you might see it 3 or 4 times. Go, oh, actually, I think I know why that is. The way I do my analysis has changed by using it, because I look for different things now, because I've seen those trends that pick up. And what we now need to do is to try and support that with some research data and stuff. But you kind of, it's chicken and egg, isn't it? I think, imagine if you had 100 people, and let's say 100 people get the same injury, and 60 of them, it's some kind of training error, because that's the biggest cause, right? But 40 of them, there's maybe 1, 2, or 3 patterns of function that could predispose or aggravate it. Intuitively, we have 3 planes of motion, so potentially it could be 3 patterns or combinations of pattern. Andy Franklin Miller's stuff on groin pain and stuff, they find patterns of function. So if I take 40 people and I do some biomechanical evaluation and I try and find a pattern of function, chances are things are going to get crossover and you don't find anything, right? Finding patterns of functions are a real challenge, and you need big data sets to do it, right? But if there truly is something in there that's making a difference, other than just everybody has to have a level of strength, everybody has to have a level of flexibility, everybody has to have a level of range of motion, then actually teasing that data out. You sometimes need people who have been seeing the same conditions or doing the same analysis over and over and over again, say, look, we've seen these patterns, right? Let's start looking at it, see whether they actually are reflective. Are they predictive? That's even better, because we only see people that are injured, don't we?
Yeah, no, it is interesting, and that's the thing. There's so much stuff that you can do with all of this, and I think it's just knowing what that is, what the limitations are, and being honest about it. Because I think anyone claiming that they can do it, whether it's a clinician or a company, is they're wrong, aren't they? Really, that there's always stuff that you can learn. So brilliant, Trevor. We've gone over what I said, so thank you for that. I was just intrigued by your answer around tech. So look, Trevor, it's been great. I've been looking forward to doing this one with you, and it's really nice for me to hear such positive feedback about you in the industry. So well done for having such a great reputation as being a good person as well as a great clinician.
Oh, thanks very much. That's kind of you.
Brilliant. Cheers, Trevor. Thank you.
Cheers.